Sometime back, I did a video called Why I Can't Get Into the Legion of Superheroes. Understandably, a few people took this to mean that I hate the Legion of Superheroes, or that I simply have no interest in them or their title, or I'm just indifferent to them. This is not the case. True, I do have a great deal of trouble getting into this franchise for all of the reasons that I mentioned in that video, but this is not for lack of trying. Despite all of the obstacles DC Comics and a few specific creators have thrown my way over the years, I've always been very interested in the Legion of Superheroes. And so, on the same shopping trip where I bought Howard Chaykin's Challengers of the Unknown book, I got 2 volumes of the Legion of Superheroes. I once made a statement to someone who reads many comic books but is not very much of an X-Men fan. The statement I made was something along the lines of, the best way to get into the X-Men is to dive headfirst, and if you don't get it or understand it, dive further. And I thought maybe this same philosophy can help me become more familiar with the Legion of Superheroes. Maybe part of the reason I have such trouble with this franchise is that I have been resistant to getting more stories featuring these characters. So that thought is what prompted me to buy the Legion of Superheroes, An Eye for an Eye, on this trip that I mentioned earlier. This book is written by Paul Levitz and co-plotted by Keith Giffen, who later took a more central position in the form of plotting the stories after this run. Art on this book is provided by Eduardo Barreto, Paris Collins, Keith Giffen, who did rough art but never did full detailed pencils, Steve Lytle, and Joe Orlando. So, all introduction out of the way, what did I think? Did this book work for me as a basically newcomer to the Legion of Superheroes? I would have to say, sadly, no, not really. Paul Levitz provides a foreword at the beginning of this book where he pretty succinctly explains who the audience for this book really is. Let me quote the man. The storyline that you are about to plunge into, in particular, has a wealth of legionnaires, villains, and worlds, and plenty of backstory that it presupposes you might have some knowledge of. But whether you're an occasional Legion reader or a devoted fan, the headlong pace of the series should carry you over any rough spots. This last bit is where I take issue with this book. It really is for hardcore fans of the series. I don't think of myself as a casual fan, really. I've read a few Legion books, the first showcase volume that collects the adventures from the late 50s, 2 volumes of Mark Waid's run on the Legion, and a volume from the New 52 Legion Lost, and a volume from the New 52 Legion of Superheroes. So it's not like I'm completely oblivious on how to swim and I'm jumping into a 20-foot pool, but despite reading all of the Legion stuff that I've just said I read, I would still consider myself someone who is basically a newcomer. And as such, I don't quite think this book does carry me over any rough spots as good as it really should. I'm going into this as much as I am to illustrate the gravity of how inappropriate this book is for someone who is not a Legion fanatic, or maybe wants to be but doesn't know where to start. If you've read about as much Legion as I have, then you might want to tread lightly if you see this book somewhere and you're curious about whether it is for you or not. But I should back up a little bit. Let me talk a little bit about the story before I get back to how this book works and for who it works. In the foreword by author Paul Levitz, he mentioned that in the early-ish mid-80s, DC did something a little bit experimental with the Legion of Superheroes. Around this time, the comic shops were just becoming a thing, and DC wanted to try and cater to fans who went to these shops. So the book that had been Legion of Superheroes became a reprint series for a new series called Legion of Superheroes, with the original title becoming Tales of the Legion of Superheroes. Back in the day, you could buy comic books on newsstands, and this was where one would find Tales of the Legion of Superheroes. Also, the newsstand series was made on a cheaper paper and cost less, and if you were reading it, you were about 6 months behind whoever was reading the new series. This is relevant to this video and this storyline because the Legion of Superheroes had never had an issue 1 before. Well, according to Levitz's foreword, there was a short series that was a reprint series that had an issue 1, but this was the first time the series had an issue 1 that had new material. This is because the series that was now going to be called Tales of the Legion of Superheroes was originally Adventure Comics back in the 1950s. Adventure Comics featured Superboy, and when the Legion of Superheroes first showed up, they were just guest stars in Superboy's regular feature in Adventure Comics. Eventually, the Legion became co-stars in Superboy's book, and eventually still, Superboy began to feature less and less in what was now the Legion of Superheroes series. So while Adventure Comics had an issue 1, Legion of Superheroes itself more or less had not. And since the very first issue of the Legion of Superheroes was going to happen, everyone involved wanted this to be a big deal. Something huge that had not ever really been done before. So at some point it was decided that a member of the Legion of Superheroes would die in this story, just to show how serious this was. I don't know if this was mandated from on high, or if the creators just wanted to do this, but do this they did. Reading the foreword by Leavitz kinda seems to indicate that this was something they chose to do, and that it was not forced on them. Also, this story involved the return of the Legion of Supervillains. Apparently, a group called the Legion of Supervillains had shown up in the Legion comics before, but that group was more or less unconnected to the group showing up in this story. This group of villains consisted of foes of the Legion who had all faced the superheroes by themselves in the past, and they were now joining forces to kill the Legion once and for all. This concept probably would work better with people who have been keeping up with the Legion for decades. Oh, you mean all of those bad guys who we like are joining forces? But for someone like me, I had no idea Chameleon Boy had an evil counterpart. This was kinda just part of the story for me. It didn't quite get me excited as I think it was meant to. I mean, the idea of a supervillain equivalent to a superhero team is always cool in my humble. The Justice League has the Secret Society of Supervillains, or the Legion of Doom, or the Injustice Gang, or whatever they're calling themselves this week. The Avengers have the Masters of Evil, the Fantastic Four has the Frightful Four. So on that level, it's pretty cool, but it also brings its fair share of problems. Just one of which is that it doesn't have that level of, oh, this is going to be off the hook, that I get the feeling it was meant to give off. The other problem is that with a team of 23 villains, yeah, I counted, and at least that many superheroes, this book really struggles to find its focus. I mean, I think, for the most part, it succeeds in making sure that this arc highlights a few characters. But the other 43 characters still take up just enough page space that it's hard for me to sometimes remember what's going on, because there is so much going on with so many people. There are quite a few things in this book that are happening and therefore taking up page space, but are not in any way relevant to the story that we got here, such as Lightning Lad and Saturn Girl's baby being born. We see the President of Earth resigning, and we get like 2 pages devoted to that little subplot. In between a couple of the issues, Legion member Wildfire disappears, and then toward the end of the storyline, we see that he's on Earth. And it is casually revealed to us that Invisible Kid, who had not even been in this book up until the very end, had taken Wildfire away from the heat of the battle. We are told that Wildfire helped Invisible Kid do something, but I'll be danged if I know what it is or why it had to happen in this story. It's one thing to seed future subplots and plots during a story, but it needs to be done organically. I have no idea why the people behind this story couldn't have just devoted an entire issue to Wildfire and Invisible Kid performing some mission and let this be a little standalone issue set after the sprawling supervillain story. As near as I can tell, doing 2 identical scenes of a team of Legionnaires mentioning that Wildfire has gone missing, and then just showing him hanging out on Earth and not showing us why he went missing, is nothing but a waste of space that could have been allocated elsewhere. Now, I should mention that I have not yet read the follow-up to this story, which I bought at the same time as I bought this book. It's very possible that all of these things will become more important in the next book. I can easily see the President and the birth subplot becoming more important, but just looking at this book by itself, those look strangely unnecessary to the overall story. And even if the Wildfire Invisible Kid story is explored later, it was still handled very poorly here. There are some other things that are actually pertinent to the story, but I still feel like I'm watching somebody juggle 100 small golf balls, and I am supposed to pay very close attention to one golf ball in particular. But I am only human, and I keep losing track in all of the blur. In this case, I get the feeling that, out of all of the villains in this book, I'm supposed to pay attention to Lightning Lord, the older brother of Legion co-founder Lightning Lad, and later Legion member Light Lass. And on the hero side of things, I guess I'm supposed to be paying attention to Light Lass. With Lightning Lord, he says near the beginning of the book that he will kill Lightning Lad. This is made kinda awkward by the fact that Lightning Lad is barely in this book and could be removed and nobody would even notice. Anyway, the Legion of Supervillains have joined forces and have taken a blood oath to each kill one Legionnaire. They even act like something really awful will happen if they fail. I'm honestly not sure what could happen to them, as the story doesn't make it especially clear. I guess it's possible that this is cleared up in the next book I have, but just looking at this story, it is handled very poorly. I'd be okay with a little bit of basic motivation here. Each of the members of this team hate the Legion of Superheroes, enough that they desperately want to enact some deadly violence on them. So they decide, to make it fair, honor among thieves and all of that they will each have the privilege to kill one Legion member, and the reason they are doing this are twofold. One, they are power hungry and slightly insane, and they think that conquest of the universe is theirs if only they eliminate the Legion. And this segues into reason 2, which is that the Legion has thwarted them in the past. If they try to go for conquest now, the Legion will get in their way. So they want revenge, and it is practical to slay the do-gooders. But here is the rub. None of this is even present in the book. All I know is that these guys want to do some conquering. But beyond that, it's not really elaborated, much to my dismay. And sure, some of this might be pretty easy to pick up on, but a lot of it, specifically why each member of this team absolutely must kill one Legionnaire, that is extremely hazy, and it doesn't do the story any favors by being so unclear. This all more or less culminates on the world of Orando, which is a world of sorcerers. One Legionnaire apparently came from this world, but she features so very little in this story that I almost don't see the point of mentioning her. Except that, and here is where big spoilers come in. If you have not read this and you want to, then I suggest you turn off the rest of this video. So, Magic Girl What's-Her-Name is dating Karate Kid, who is also a Legionnaire. And apparently, co-plotter and artist for this story, Keith Giffen, did not like this character. When it was decided that a Legionnaire would die, Paul Levitz revealed in the foreword that Keith Giffen picked his least favorite character in the Legion to kill off. I guess it's fine that Giffen wanted to get rid of a character he did not like, but the problem is that Karate Kid barely features in this book. I could be mistaken, but I'm pretty sure him and his honey weren't even in this book at all until they come back from what I think was a vacation and they return to their homeworld, Orando, which has now been taken over by the supervillains. Before this, they weren't even in the story. Remember, the people behind this story wanted the story to feel important, so they decided that they would kill off a Legionnaire. But how important does it really feel when this member wasn't even with the team for the entire story? Not to mention, this death seemed entirely avoidable and pointless. Karate Kid is fighting the leader of the villains, Nemesis Kid. They fight a long time, and then Karate Kid decides to fly into one of these giant ball thingies that the villains have surrounding the planet, and he dies. I don't know why, nor do I think he actually accomplished anything by doing this. In fact, this completely nonsensical death reminded me of the death of the X-Man known as Thunderbird, from way back in Chris Claremont's opening story on X-Men. If you recall, Thunderbird just decided he would attack an airplane, and he wound up exploding while doing so, when his teammate had long-range powers that could have more easily attacked said plane, and would have resulted in roughly 100% fewer deaths for the good guys. I get the same sense of confusion when I read Karate Kid's death. Why did he do this? There's a very quick line about how he was already basically going to die anyway, I guess from the fist fight with Nemesis Kid. But did he just think exploding was a better way to die? I get that Giffen did not like this character, but if they wanted this death to feel important, then he deserved better than what he got. Anyway, I guess I should move on. I mentioned earlier that Lightlass is the one character who this book tries to focus on the most. And I have to say, I do care a little bit more about her as a character now than I did, say, a week ago. In fact, Lightlass is the one character in this book who goes through any kind of character arc. If I took away one thing from this book, it was the way, in my humble, a Legion story should usually be done. This is just broad strokes, but this is, in my opinion, how a Legion story should always be handled. A Legion story will almost definitely feature some 20 main characters, so for however long the story is, the creative team should have one character from that lot that the brunt of the story focuses on. If you don't do that, if you try to do something with more than one or two characters, you're going to end up having a bit of a mess. Arguably, this book is already a bit of a mess, but I would say a redeemable quality is that Light Lass is made very real to me, as I knew next to nothing about her before reading this story. Light Lass's arc is very well handled, although I'm a little disappointed in how it turned out. When this book starts, Light Lass is a retired member of the Legion, and just wants to live her life in peace away from the fights and wars and such. According to her, the Legion has gotten too complicated. The fighting they do is more complex than she would like, and she just wants a life separate from that. Conveniently for the plot, Lightning Lord wants Light Lass to join the supervillains. In his mind, if you're not part of the Legion of Superheroes, then you're automatically against them. Which is a little stupid, but Light Lass calls him on that, although it doesn't do her any good, as she mentions this like 5 times over the course of this whole book. So, over the course of Light Lass at first just trying to survive while in the hands of the Legion of Supervillains, and then trying to go save her former teammates, she comes to the realization that fighting evil is all that the Legion is about. The faces and names might change, but their mission statement remains the same. And so she decides that she's been on vacation long enough and that it's time to come back to work. My problem with this is that I actually like the idea of a character who is friendly with the Legion, but has a legit reason not to be part of the Legion. Light Lass's reason for wanting to stay away was reasonable, I thought, and it made her stand out in a comic of about 30 or so young people who are all part of the same team. It fleshes her out, in other words. Now, her deciding to go back, I guess, doesn't undo this characterization, but upon returning, how does Light Lass differ from, say, Sunboy or Phantom Girl? Her joining the team turns her back into just another member of the team. Although she wouldn't have really gone through an arc, so to speak, I still think it would have been much better if she had remained firm about not coming back to the Legion. But my big problem with this is that Light Lass isn't even a part of the Legion, yet she is the one who gets the most focus. In the end, it kind of makes the rest of the team feel somewhat superfluous. And although the book does only do a good job of focusing on Light Lass, it does at least try to focus on the rest of the team. But they are only here anyway, it seems to me, to take page space away from the one character who is being used in a way that makes me care about her and understand her a little bit more. For instance, at one point in the book, 5 or so Legionnaires get separated from the rest of their teammates. I cannot actually figure out why this happened, and because there is so much else going on, it isn't ever really explained. Just like how Wildfire spontaneously disappears and reappears without so much as a how do you do. At the end of the day, I would qualify this book as serviceable. It's entirely possible that this is one of those things that starts out not so good, but as the series goes along, the creators find their stride and everything gets better. The problem is, even if this is true, this and the next volume contain 13 issues of Legion Volume 3. And then the next trade paperback to collect any comics from Volume 3 of the Legion of Superheroes starts at issue 62, and is actually part of a rebooted timeline. So even if this book was absolutely mind-blowingly awesome, it wouldn't be a good place to start if you know nothing about the Legion, because it reboots just as soon as you can remember everyone's name. But this book isn't mind-blowingly awesome. It's not awful, it's just not good. That's about the best I can say about it, unfortunately. That's all I have to say about this book, but I will be back tomorrow with some other kind of video. Be sure to come back and see what else I might be talking about. And for now, be sure to like, share, comment, and subscribe, and do all the things that you love doing on YouTube videos. Until then, I'll see you guys in a later place and time. Have a good one.